In fact, synthetic happiness has almost always been understood as something that we have to put some effort toward achieving. This is important because what this says is that our ability to create states of happiness is dependent on our environment, but also requires effort from us. The basic takeaway of that episode is that it turns out receiving gratitude is a more powerful stimulus for the release of neurochemicals and activation of brain areas associated with so-called pro-social behaviors and feelings of well-being, including happiness. You can start to access more happiness, again, genuine happiness, simply by framing certain choices in a particular way, and maybe even by eliminating choices. Now I'd like to focus on the research aimed at understanding what increases our levels of happiness. And I'd like to frame this under the umbrella of two major themes. The first theme is so-called natural happiness. Natural happiness is the sort of happiness that most of us are familiar with. So the kind of happiness that we expect to have if we, for instance, complete a degree, hopefully a degree in a topic meaningful and interesting to us, but a degree nonetheless. Or we find a mate, hopefully a mate that we enjoy spending time with. Or for instance, making a certain income or finding work that we enjoy on a regular basis. All of those are forms of happiness that from a very early time in development, we are taught exist. For instance, even when we are very young, we are told that our birthday is coming and that we are going to get presents, and those presents are going to be focused on knowledge of things that we already enjoy. So if you're a little kid and you like trucks, or you're a little kid and you like dolls, you can sort of expect that those gifts will bring you some level of joy or happiness. And while that's a small child example, that general notion of natural happiness is, of course, one that persists into adolescence, into young adulthood, and into adulthood. And we, quite understandably, come to associate this feeling of joy or happiness with the receiving of things or the acquisition of things, whether by effort, by gift, by inheritance, or some other form. Okay, so that's natural happiness. And yet, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's also this notion of synthetic happiness. And some of the more interesting and exciting research in the fields of psychology and, in fact, neuroscience point to this idea of synthetic happiness as at least as powerful a source of happiness as natural happiness. Again, at least as powerful, and perhaps even more powerful. And of course, one has to take a slightly different view of what happiness is in order to accept this idea that we can create happiness for ourselves. But that doesn't mean that the whole notion of synthetic happiness is merely a passive one, where all we do is sit back and imagine being happy and then we are happy. For better or for worse, our nervous systems and our neurochemistry simply don't work that way. In fact, synthetic happiness has almost always been understood as something that we have to put some effort toward achieving. But, and this is an important thing to point out, synthetic happiness also requires that certain situational or environmental conditions be met. A good example of this is some of the work by Gillian Mandich, or I should say Dr. Gillian Mandich, who's done some interesting work on the conditions for creating happiness within our mind and in our overall state of being. And she's been involved in a number of different studies, but one of the ones that I found particularly interesting is one in which they explored different types of music and other aspects of environmental settings. So you bring subjects to the laboratory, play them different types of music. There are, in fact, certain aspects of music that can create different states of mind: sadness, happiness, anticipation. In fact, there are certain patterns of music that can reliably induce anticipation of the fear and anxiety-based type. So, for instance, think the movie Jaws. If you recall, for those of you that have seen Jaws, there's this ongoing theme music anytime the shark might be present in the water or in a given scene that essentially goes dun, dun. Now, for the musicians out there, this has basis in things like tritones and things that are understood from the mathematics and the musical side, and from the neuroscience side are known to create a neural state of anticipation. Yeah, a neural state of anticipation, and not necessarily a positive one. And indeed, there are other patterns of music that involve uptones. Think some of the music that's typically been used in cartoons of various sorts. There's a long history of this. Indeed, there's a whole literature of psychological, and now even a smaller but still interesting literature on the neuroscience of how certain patterns of Music can induce a state of joy and joyful anticipation in particular. A lot of those patterns of music are incorporated into so-called happy cartoons and Disney movies and things of that sort. In any case, Dr. Mandich and others have explored how music in particular, but other features of the environment, can or cannot induce states of happiness. And the basic takeaway from those studies is that while having a certain environmental sound, musical tone, or visual feature to a given space, a room, is necessary for a state of happiness, it is not alone sufficient. What is required is that individuals not only be placed into an environment that contains music or visual items, or a combination of music and visual items that can induce states of joy or happiness or positive anticipation, but that they also are given some sort of instruction or instruction manual as to how to synthesize happiness inside of that environment. This is important because what this says is that our ability to create states of happiness is dependent on our environment, but also requires effort from us. That also makes sense as to why when we are under conditions of deprivation, so it could be social deprivation or financial deprivation, or even for people that are very sensitive to weather, there are a certain number of individuals, about 30% of people who report feeling very, very low under conditions where the sky is overcast, especially if it's been overcast for a number of days, the so-called seasonal affective depression. Those individuals, by the way, can often receive tremendous benefits in terms of elevating their mood if they make an effort to get sunlight, and if they can't get sunlight, artificial light of the sort that we talked about earlier. But in any case, there are a number of people that are profoundly negatively influenced by the lack of positive visual and auditory cues in their environment. But for most people, we are in what I would call a dynamic relationship with our environment. Our environment has an effect on our mood, but the research indicates that we also need to make some sort of effort toward being happy. Now, effort toward being happy is a very vague term, so let's better define what that is. In the case of Dr. Mandich's work, this took the form of doing so-called happiness inventories, right? That can be focusing on things that one is grateful for, things that they particularly enjoy. This is somewhat of a gratitude type practice, but includes some other features as well that are more focused on the things that bring you meaning and actually engaging in the things that bring you meaning. So if you're trying to think about how to improve your levels of happiness, what this research essentially says is that you would be smart to try and adjust your home environment, adjust your work environment so that it is cheerful to you. Maybe that means a plant. For me, in my laboratory, one of the things that was really critical that I had as a postdoc and in my own laboratory when I first started my lab was I love aquaria. So I had multiple fish tanks. In fact, people in my laboratory were always rolling their eyes. Why do we have to have all these fish tanks with all these? I like freshwater tanks, not saltwater tanks, for reasons that aren't interesting for this discussion. But freshwater tanks with discus fish, for instance, to me are just beautiful. They make me happy. I just enjoy them. Music is a complicated thing in laboratories because it's a shared space, so headphones are the general requirement. But having either silence, if you love silence, and I happen to like working in silence or listening to certain forms of music. I do also use the 40 hertz binaural beats, or I particularly like listening to Glenn Gould while I work, or listening to whale song, believe it or not, while I work, because it doesn't have any structure that I can follow. I don't speak whale, and so I can't follow, but it sort of fills the space in a way that I find pleasant. And I've put substantial amounts of effort into making my laboratory spaces and my office spaces, my workspaces, nice places to be. Now, I had no knowledge of this work from Dr. Mandich and others at the time when I did that, but what I found was that over the years, I was challenged in maintaining a kind of elevated mood while working in a laboratory, not because I didn't thoroughly enjoy the work. I love doing experiments with my hands and I loved being in lab, but at least the labs that I was in as a graduate student and postdoc, there were no windows, so I wasn't getting adequate sunshine. The windows that we didn't open, so I wasn't getting a lot of fresh air, and so on and so forth. So I've personally found it very valuable to create an environment, both at work and at home, that I find aesthetically pleasant. at least in some way or another. And I realize people have varying levels of control over their aesthetic environment. Certainly the auditory environment can be controlled nowadays through the use of headphones, if you're allowed to use those. So for instance, using music or using background sound that you find very pleasant, combined with a concerted effort on your part to create states of happiness by hopefully doing work that's meaningful to you, or at least is leading to meaningful outcomes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But these happiness inventories also turn out to be interesting and important sources of creating so-called synthetic happiness. And we will also talk about other ways that one can create elevated levels of synthetic happiness. And I realize the word synthetic probably draws up connotations of false happiness or contrived happiness. I wish instead of calling it synthetic happiness, they had called it self-created or self-directed happiness or something of that sort, because then it wouldn't sound as false, because it's simply not false. It leads to the same, as far as we know, identical neurochemical and psychological states of happiness as natural happiness, and might even be more persistent than natural happiness. It certainly is more under our control. But the key point is that environment and self-directed work at being happy are both important, and they interact with one another. So if you're somebody who has a hard time synthesizing happiness through any of the methods that we talk about today, don't consider yourself deficient. It could very well be that the environment that you're in, social environment or physical environment or auditory environment, is simply not conducive to synthesizing happiness. And for that reason, I think the work of Jillian Mandich and colleagues and others in the field is tremendously important, because it removes us from this pressure to just synthesize happiness from within despite our circumstances. I think many of us have heard of the incredible stories of people like Viktor Frankl or Nelson Mandela, who were stripped of their freedom and yet managed to maintain some sense of positive anticipation, or at least some sense of identity that allowed them to still access forms of happiness. Those are highly unique situations, of course, and they speak to the power of the human psyche for synthesizing happiness, and certainly for synthesizing a sense that there might be a future, and to live into that future in their cases incredibly impressive ways. But I think for most everybody, the environment that we're in has a powerful impact on our mood, and some people more than others. I know people that are perfectly happy with blank walls, no pictures on the walls. Other people benefit tremendously from having photos or plants in their environment, and so on. You really have to determine what's needed for you and do your best to try and place those things into your environment, or rather place yourself into an environment that is conducive to you synthesizing your happiness. In fact, the powerful interaction between our environment and our own ability to generate certain kinds of emotions is well established, not just for happiness, but for things like gratitude. So for instance, there's a classic study from Ames, AMES, in 2004 that was focused on gratitude. And we've had an episode on gratitude before. The basic takeaway of that episode is that it turns out receiving gratitude is a more powerful stimulus for the release of neurochemicals and activation of brain areas associated with so-called prosocial behaviors and feelings of well-being, including happiness, but also observing stories in the form of movies or books or other narratives of other people receiving help is also a very powerful stimulus for gratitude. Also, giving gratitude is very powerful, but not as powerful as receiving gratitude, at least that's what the research says, or observing powerful exchanges of gratitude between other individuals. What the study from Ames showed is that gratitude as a state of mind and as an emotion does not exist in a vacuum. It's not independent of our surroundings. So for instance, just writing down all the things you're grateful for, while it has some positive impact, the impact of that or receiving gratitude or observing gratitude is far more potent, right? Bigger increases in happiness and feelings of well-being, and indeed neurochemicals and activation of brain areas associated with happiness and well-being when there's a reciprocity, when the person receiving understands something about the person that's giving to them and understands that the person is giving genuinely, for instance. So there's an environmental interaction. It's not just about receiving, it's receiving from somebody that you know genuinely wants to give. And likewise for the giver in that equation, the feelings of well-being are far greater when the person receiving whatever it is, money, food, assistance in some form or another, it could be, physical assistance, etc., when the giver has knowledge that the person receiving it genuinely needed the thing that they are receiving. So the important finding within the research again and again is that happiness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's partially our own responsibility to synthesize happiness. Now, I was told that many times in your life, happiness is in your head. Well, yes, indeed, it's in your head, but it's also dependent on interactions with your environment, physical environment and social environment and so on. Likewise, gratitude is something that we can create inside of us, right, through gratitude lists and appreciation, or we can give, both powerful sources of evoking neurochemical changes associated with gratitude and happiness and well-being. But it too doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a much greater positive effect when we have knowledge about why the giver is giving us something, or that the person receiving something is going to benefit tremendously from receiving it. So I'm highlighting this because I think that when we hear about synthetic happiness, there's a kind of automatic erasing of context that tends to occur. And in fact, if you were to peruse the various videos online or papers that exist on PubMed around happiness and synthetic happiness in particular, you would come away with the impression that synthetic happiness is just something that we're supposed to snap our fingers and access, or perhaps do very specific things and access. But while that is true, context really matters. And I think that's an important point, much in the same way that the point needs to be made that while money doesn't buy happiness, money can buffer stress and certainly offer opportunities that can provide opportunities for more happiness. So I think we are starting to arrive at a general theme here, which is that nothing related to our mood exists in isolation.
Thank you.